Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless Official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The walls of the Newman ranch seemed to close in with an almost suffocating weight as the shocking truth Michael Baldwin carried pressed against his chest like a leaden secret he could no longer keep contained, and when he finally found himself standing across from Victoria Newman, who had been clinging desperately to the fragile illusion that she was slowly piecing her fractured family back together in the aftermath of Claire's arrival into their lives, he knew that what he was about to reveal would not only shatter her composure but might very well alter the trajectory of her daughter's future and the Newman family legacy forever, because Michael, in his role as both trusted lawyer and reluctant truth-bearer, had stumbled across something so earth-shaking in its implications that no amount of legal maneuvering or emotional cushioning could soften the blow. And so with a grave expression that made Victoria's heart begin to pound with dread, he took a slow breath and told her the words she never expected to hear. Victoria, Claire is not my biological child, a revelation that hit her like a thunderclap because for months now the narrative had been tangled with questions about Claire's lineage, her place in the family, and her connection to Michael as her supposed father, and though Victoria's mind reeled trying to piece together what he was saying, Michael quickly reached into his briefcase, his hands trembling with the weight of history, and withdrew a worn, carefully preserved letter that instantly caught Victoria's eye, the name on the envelope sending her pulse skyrocketing into disbelief, for there, in faded but unmistakable handwriting, was the signature of Cole Howard, the man who had once been one of the greatest loves of her life, the man who had shared with her a tragic and unforgettable chapter that included the heartbreaking loss of their baby girl Eve all those years ago. And as Michael pressed the letter into her hand, his voice heavy with both regret and resolve, he explained that this was not just a random document dug up from the past, but a letter that Cole had written, a letter that contained the truth about the daughter Victoria thought she had lost, a letter that directly connected Claire to her and Cole in a way that no one could have ever predicted, shaking the very foundation of everything Victoria thought she knew about her child and her past. And as her eyes scanned the opening lines, her breath catching with every word, she realized that the secret she had mourned for decades was never what it seemed, that somehow in the labyrinth of lies and manipulations orchestrated by Jordan and the shadows of the past, the child she had been told was gone was in fact alive, and not only alive but standing right here in Genoa City as the young woman she had come to know as Claire. And Victoria's knees nearly buckled under the gravity of it all, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped the letter, but Michael steadied her hand, urging her to keep reading, his own eyes clouded with the storm of knowing that this truth, though devastating, was also liberating, and as Victoria's lips silently formed the words Cole had written, she could almost hear his voice, that gentle mix of strength and vulnerability that had once anchored her in the midst of chaos, confessing in ink that he had known the truth about their child far longer than anyone suspected, that forces beyond their control had stolen Eve away from them, only for her to be placed into another life under another name, and that Claire's existence was not an accident or a random twist of fate, but a cruelly orchestrated deception that had kept mother, father, and daughter apart for decades. And as the enormity of the revelation washed over her, Victoria's mind flickered back to every moment she had spent with Claire, the hesitations, the instincts, the almost primal pull she had felt toward the young woman without being able to explain why, and now all those puzzle pieces fell into place with a devastating clarity, because Claire was her daughter, her flesh and blood, her connection to Cole that fate had stolen and hidden away, and Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears that blurred the words on the page as Michael, his voice hoarse with the strain of bearing such a painful truth, reminded her that this wasn't about blame or guilt but about giving Claire the identity and family that had been denied her. And though Victoria's heart raced with 1,000 questions, why Cole had kept this secret hidden in a letter rather than telling her directly, why Michael had been forced into the role of messenger, why life had chosen to resurrect this grief after so many years, what rang most loudly in her soul was the undeniable truth that the daughter she had believed was lost had been returned, and as she pressed the letter to her chest, torn between anguish and gratitude, she whispered Cole's name like a prayer, feeling as though the universe had both betrayed and blessed her in the same cruel twist, while Michael, quietly watching her unravel and reconstruct herself in real time, knew that the storm was only beginning, because the ripples of this revelation would not stop with Victoria, they would surge outward to Claire, to Cole himself, to the Newman family dynasty, and to every ally and enemy who understood the seismic power of bloodlines in Genoa City. And as the silence between them deepened into something almost unbearable, Victoria finally lifted her tear-streaked face to Michael and asked the only question that mattered, her voice shaking like glass about to shatter. How do I tell her? A question Michael had no easy answer for, because the truth, once spoken, could never be contained again, and Claire's world, like Victoria's, was about to be changed forever in ways no one could yet predict, a revelation that promised not only heartbreak but also the fragile, flickering hope of a family made whole again, if only they could survive the reckoning that came with it. Victoria's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, her heartbeat thunderous in her ears as she clutched Cole's letter to her chest, the edges of the paper threatening to crumple under the pressure of her trembling hands, because even as the truth settled in, raw, unrelenting, impossible to deny, her mind fought against it, wrestling with decades of grief, unanswered questions, and a mother's deepest instinct to believe that once her child was declared gone, there was no coming back. Yet here was Michael, her most trusted confidant, standing before her not as the slick attorney who always found loopholes in the law, but as a reluctant prophet carrying the most explosive revelation of her life, and she couldn't decide if she wanted to scream, collapse, or fall into his arms for support, though pride kept her rooted in place, Newman steel warring with Newman vulnerability, and her thoughts spun like shards of glass in a storm, Cole's voice whispering in the letter, Claire's cautious eyes. The first day they met, Jordan's manipulations, the uncanny familiarity that had tugged at her heart whenever she looked at Claire, all converging into a reality so profound it made her dizzy, and she suddenly realized that this moment wasn't only about her, it was about the young woman who had been lied to, twisted, and manipulated her entire life, a girl who had fought against Jordan's control and was only now beginning to find her footing in Genoa City, because Claire Peterson, or Claire Newman Howard, as the truth demanded she be called, had been robbed of her history, her identity, her parents, and if Victoria was reeling from the revelation, what would it do to her daughter when she learned that her very existence had been built upon decades of cruel deceit? And Victoria's eyes snapped back to Michael, demanding silently for him to continue, to explain how this truth had surfaced now, after all these years, and Michael's jaw tightened as he admitted that in the process of reviewing old estate documents, a sealed packet had surfaced in Cole's archives, one that he had instructed to be passed to Victoria if certain circumstances ever arose, and Michael had debated for days whether to bring it forward, knowing that once this bell was rung, it could never be unrung, but after seeing the way Victoria had been struggling to connect with Claire, sensing the undercurrent of something unresolved, he realized the truth could no longer remain hidden, and as he spoke, Victoria's tears fell unchecked, though her spine remained rigid, because while her heart screamed with longing to run to Claire, to wrap her arms around her and tell her she was her daughter, her logical mind whispered caution, reminding her of the fragility of trust, of the damage Jordan's brainwashing had inflicted, of the need to tread carefully with a girl who had already been ripped apart by so many betrayals. Yet even with her protective instincts firing, she couldn't stop the surge of maternal love that threatened to overwhelm her, the voice inside her declaring with absolute certainty, "My daughter is alive, and she's here, and I will never let her go again," and she pressed her lips together to keep from sobbing outright, because Newman women did not collapse, they endured, they fought, they rebuilt, and as she straightened her shoulders, determination replacing some of the shock, she whispered that she needed to see Cole, needed to hear his voice not just in the letter, but in person, because if anyone could help her navigate this impossible revelation, it was him, the man who had lost alongside her, the man whose grief had mirrored her own, and Michael nodded, saying carefully that Cole had known his letter might someday reach her, that he had carried his own torment quietly, and though Victoria wanted to be furious at him for keeping such a monumental truth from her for so long, her heart knew that grief made people act in unimaginable ways, and perhaps Cole had believed he was protecting her, protecting them both, and as she considered the possibility of seeing him again with this truth between them, she felt something she hadn't dared to in years, hope, raw and trembling, but hope nonetheless, and then the image of Claire flashed before her eyes, her guarded smile, her tentative steps toward belonging, and Victoria knew with unshakable conviction that telling Claire would be the most difficult yet most necessary act of her life, because this wasn't just about her pain or Cole's regrets or Michael's burden of truth, it was about Claire, who deserved to know that she was loved, wanted, and cherished not as some orphan manipulated by a monster, but as the daughter of two people who had once loved fiercely and still carried that bond in their bones. And as Victoria's thoughts tumbled, Michael reminded her gently that timing was everything. That one misstep could undo all the fragile progress Claire had made, and Victoria nodded even as her spirit burned with urgency, because Newman blood meant strength but also complication, and when Victor Newman learned that his granddaughter was in fact Eve, the daughter of Cole and Victoria, there would be no stopping the tidal wave of emotions, decisions, and inevitable power struggles, and for a brief moment Victoria closed her eyes, imagining her father's face when he discovered that the girl he had regarded with suspicion was in fact family, that fate had given him a granddaughter in the most unexpected way, and though she knew Victor's instinct would be to protect, to fold Claire into the dynasty with a possessiveness that bordered on suffocating, she also feared his controlling nature might smother the delicate healing Claire needed, and the thought made her resolve harden. This time, she would not let anyone dictate what was best for her daughter, not Victor, not Nikki, not Nick, not even Cole. This was her journey as a mother, and she would stand in front of the world itself if it meant protecting Claire's heart, because she had been denied the chance once and she would not let it happen again. And Michael, sensing her resolve, finally exhaled the breath he'd been holding since the moment he handed her the letter, telling her softly that whatever storm came next, she would not face it alone, because he would stand with her, not as her lawyer but as her friend. And Victoria, her eyes glistening with both gratitude and sorrow, whispered a quiet thank you, knowing that in the days to come every truth, every lie, every bond in Genoa City would be tested, because the revelation that Claire was her daughter, Cole's daughter, and Newman by blood, was not just a family secret, it was a bomb that would shake the entire city to its core. The letter still clutched tightly in her hand, Victoria could hardly remember the last time she had felt so unmoored, as though the ground beneath her had been ripped away and she was suspended between grief, shock, and a flicker of joy she was almost afraid to claim, because even as the truth whispered through every cell of her body that Claire was hers, that the daughter she had mourned for decades was alive and standing in Genoa City, a lifetime of loss made it impossible to trust happiness without also fearing the rug would be pulled away again. And as she paced the length of the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood like frantic heartbeats, she imagined the thousand different ways this revelation could play out, and at the center of every possibility was Claire, the young woman whose life had been a storm of manipulation, betrayal, and stolen choices, a girl who had fought so hard to carve out a place for herself amid the chaos Jordan had created, and now Victoria was tasked with giving her something both miraculous and terrifying, the truth of who she really was, a truth that could either set her free or shatter her fragile healing beyond repair, and the sheer weight of that responsibility nearly buckled Victoria's knees as she turned back toward Michael, asking in a voice that cracked despite her best efforts to stay composed how he expected her to do this, how a mother tells her child that everything she believed about herself was a lie, how she reveals that the pain and emptiness Claire had carried for years had a name, a history, a family, and Michael, ever the pragmatic voice of reason though clearly shaken himself, admitted that there was no easy way, that sometimes the truth was a wrecking ball but in its destruction it cleared the space for something real to be built. And as Victoria absorbed his words, her thoughts swirled back to Cole, to the man who had written the letter that was now burning against her palm, and she could almost hear his voice as she read and reread the lines in her mind, lines that spoke of regret, of love, of helplessness in the face of forces that had stolen their child from them, and though anger flickered within her, how dare he leave her in the dark, how dare he bear this knowledge alone, another part of her understood the unbearable burden of grief, the way it warped judgment and made cowards of even the bravest hearts, and she knew that whatever his reasons, Cole had loved their child, and he had loved her, and that love had endured through the decades, etched in every word of the letter, and the thought of seeing him again filled her with both dread and longing, because she didn't know whether she would embrace him or demand answers, but she knew she needed him, needed his presence to steady her as they faced the truth together. And then the image of Claire rose again before her, vivid and piercing, her hesitant smile, her nervous energy when she entered a room, the way she looked at Victoria sometimes with a longing she couldn't quite mask, as though her soul recognized something her mind had not yet named, and the memory made Victoria's throat close with emotion, because all along Claire had been reaching for her, and Victoria had been reaching back without even knowing why, and now the reason stood clear as sunlight. Blood recognized blood, love recognized love, and fate, no matter how twisted, had brought them back together, and the thought made her heart ache. With both joy and fury at the years they had lost, the moments stolen, the birthdays uncelebrated, the mother-daughter bond that should have been unbreakable but had instead been buried under layers of lies, and as she imagined the confrontation to come, she prayed silently that Claire would not turn away, that she would not see this revelation as another betrayal but as a bridge back to the life she was meant to have, and Michael, watching the war play out across her face, told her gently that when the time came she needed to speak not as a Newman, not as a businesswoman, not as someone who always had to maintain control, but simply as a mother, because Claire would not need strategies or explanations, she would need love, pure and unvarnished, and Victoria's lips trembled as she whispered that she didn't know if she remembered how to be that vulnerable, and Michael reminded her that the heart never forgets, and though the words brought her no immediate comfort, she clung to them like a lifeline, because in the days to come she would need every ounce of courage she possessed, not just for herself but for Claire, for Cole, for the future that was suddenly wide open and terrifying in its possibility, and as she folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest one last time before tucking it back into its envelope, she felt the weight of destiny pressing down on her shoulders, a weight she was both terrified and determined to carry, because for the first time in decades she had the chance to rewrite the ending of her greatest tragedy, and she would not squander it, no matter what storm lay ahead. Victoria sat down heavily on the edge of the sofa, the letter still clutched tightly in her hand, her mind a whirlwind of memories, fears, and impossible hope, because now the weight of the truth was no longer just information, it was a living, breathing reality that demanded action, demanded courage, demanded that she face her daughter with every ounce of honesty she had ever learned to wield. And she knew that Claire's life would never be the same, that the carefully constructed world the girl had built for herself, her independence, her sense of identity, her place in Genoa City, would be upended in the most profound way possible, and yet Victoria also knew that the heart of a mother was a force unlike any other, capable of withstanding betrayals, navigating storms, and offering love so fierce and unwavering that it could pierce through decades of deception, and as she gathered her composure, pressing the envelope to her chest as though it could absorb her fear and transform it into courage, she imagined Claire walking through the Newman estate doors, blissfully unaware of the revelation that was about to reshape her entire existence, and the thought made Victoria's chest tighten, because she could already see the confusion in her daughter's eyes, the hesitation, the quiet questions, the almost imperceptible longing for a connection she had always felt but never understood. And Victoria knew she had to tread delicately, that every word, every gesture, every glance would carry the weight of a lifetime of secrets finally unmasked, and as she rehearsed in her mind the first words she would speak, the gentle way she would frame the truth, the careful balance of sorrow and hope, she felt a surge of determination unlike anything she had experienced in years, because no matter how devastating the revelation, no matter how Claire might initially react, this was the moment that could finally reunite a family that had been fractured by lies, by circumstance, by the cruel hand of fate, and Michael's earlier counsel echoed in her mind, his reminder that she must speak as a mother first, as a Newman second, as a woman who had endured the pain of loss and betrayal but who also carried the unbreakable strength of love, and she realized that she had never truly understood the full power of that strength until now, until she faced the reality that her daughter, her very own blood, had been kept from her for decades, and as she visualized the confrontation, she felt a mixture of fear, excitement, and resolve, knowing that the next step would not only define her relationship with Claire but also set the stage for Cole's return, for the inevitable confrontation with Victor and Nikki, for the cascade of emotions that would ripple through the Newman dynasty and beyond, and yet amid all the anxiety, Victoria felt a glimmer of serenity, because she knew that truth, no matter how long suppressed, was a force that demanded recognition, a force that could finally, after years of silence and loss, restore what had been taken, and as she waited for Claire to arrive, every passing second stretched into eternity, each tick of the clock echoing in her chest like a drumbeat heralding both the reckoning and the possibility of redemption, and she took a deep breath, pressing the letter once more to her lips as if to absorb the courage it contained, the love it bore, the promise that though the road ahead would be fraught with heartbreak and tension, it would also hold the potential for reunion, for understanding.